Right, so we will wait a couple of seconds for everyone to join the Zoom. Otherwise, good morning, everyone. Hi, hello, good afternoon, depending where you are in the world, and welcome to this Landscape Live series. So today we're delighted to have Todd Ehlers from University of Glasgow to talk about landscape evolutions and the interactions with biota. As usual, the talk will be roughly 45 to 50 minutes long, and we will open the chat near the end to have a discussion and questions. You can also raise your hand, and we will unmute you if you want to ask your question directly to Todd. So, Todd, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you, Boris. And thank you very much for the invitation to talk to everyone about this. It occurred to me while I was preparing this talk, I should have used a different title because I've been using the same title for about 5 years now, and people might think they're going to hear the same talk. And I've kept the same title because I've been working on basically this problem for 10 years, and I can assure you that about 70–80% of the content is different from the last time anyone heard this. So hopefully I give you something interesting to think about. Okay, so this image that you see here in front of you, this was published by Johnson and Henfrey in the mid-1800s, and it provides a real nice starting point for what I want to talk about today. What's depicted here, it kind of builds upon the Naturgemälde von Alexander von Humboldt, and you see the Andes Mountains, the Himalayas, the Alps and Pyrenees here in the Swedish Lapland. And what's being depicted is that as you change latitude and elevation, that you get different biota on the surface. And at the time, this was quite revolutionary. What I'm going to talk about today is actually taking this forward in time now and ask the question, how does this vegetation actually, if you're looking at different latitudes like this, how does this influence the surface processes that are active on these different landscapes here? So that's where we're headed. Before I get into the nitty-gritty, and need to see my slides advance, there we go. I just want to say thank you to the folks you see here. I'll be showing you mostly recently published work and also some unpublished stuff. And this has really been a group effort with all of the folks you see here. And it's not just my efforts, but also that of many other people. But you can blame me for the interpretations if you have issues with it. Okay, so where are we going? Well, I want to start with a little bit of motivation. And the way we often think of mountain ranges, like what we see on the right-hand side here today, we take this for granted. When I was a graduate student, this wasn't the case. But we think of this as an interaction between these three different processes. So you have tectonics that are producing the landscape, climate that's evolving as that topography develops, and then surface processes that operate as a function of that climate and those tectonic processes there. So this has become pretty well accepted these days. However, more recently, what we've started to get interested in as a community, meaning that's the we, are these biologic components here. And when you look at a small, in this case, this is a Rhapsodopsis here growing, it's just tremendous amounts of things that are going on here, both physically and chemically. So what you have going on is that, biogeochemical processes that relate to rock weathering and the conversion of rock into regolith and soil. But in addition to it, all these different stems that are on these individual plants here are physically influencing the transport of sediment by modifying the shear stress across this landscape if it was tilted and water could flow. So, I'm not the first person to be interested in this and think about this, and there's a long history on this kind of topic here, going back almost 100 years to this really nice figure by Longbine and Schoem here, where they've plotted effective precipitation. This is a number of catchments, large catchments, versus the average annual sediment yield on the vertical axis. So you can think of that as erosion rate. And what's really interesting about this is that, you have this kind of nonlinear bidirectional effect going on here, which they interpreted as being a function of the different ecosystems that kick in as you have different amounts of precipitation here. Now, truth be told, there's actually only about 6 data points on this plot here. And this has raised a lot of interest over the years. And the numerous other people have looked at this to kind of validate this and see if it works. And in 2001, there was a really nice kind of synthesis of this concept published by Cliff Reevey. And that's what you see here, where we're looking at average precipitation versus erosion rate now. And the Longbine and Schoen curve is actually one of these that's buried in here. But the point is, it looks like a pot of spaghetti. And the question, it then kind of begs the question, well, what is the relationship then between biota, precipitation, and erosion rate? And this leads to a modification in how we think about this system here. And the question then being, well, do we take our conventional kind of diagram here for how mountain landscapes evolve? Do we need to be thinking about biota or not? So that's where we're headed. And I've structured this talk around testing this hypothesis here, which is that if vegetation influences erosion, then it'll have a bidirectional or nonlinear effect on erosion. But this effect will depend on the climate and ecological zone you're looking at. So essentially what I'm doing is testing this Longbine and Schoen relationship that I just showed you here. The remainder of this talk is going to be kind of structured around the way I work in my research. So I really enjoy integrating a large amount of observations and trying to understand them through process-based models. So what I'm going to do is show you some diverse observations that I think also help motivate this problem a little bit further. Then I'll show you a coupled modeling framework that we've spent about the last 10 years developing to look at these different observations, and then present you some results looking at a variety of different timescales on how biota interacts with topographic processes. Figure on the right hints to where I'm going to go. This is my favorite continent here, and we'll be looking at the western margin of the Andes here. So to give you a little bit of background on the Andes, if you're not familiar with it, it's a fantastic origin for many reasons. One of them that's nice for purposes of this study is that you've had the subducting Farallon and Nazca plate that have been going under South America for actually over 200 million years. I'll be looking a lot today at the coastal and pre-Cordilleras, which are the westernmost parts of the Andes here. And the topography there started developing, we think, around the last 40 million years, particularly in this region here. And this topography, that our best estimate is that this is actually growing. You'll see pictures in a minute, but it's relatively subdued on the order of, a couple hundred to maybe meters to maybe a kilometer. But it seems to correlate with the present day topography with the kind of background seismicity that's associated with the subduction of the Nazca plate along strike there. I'm also going to be zooming in quite a bit here to Coastal Cordillera of Chile. And this is a region that's been part of the Earthshape project, which was a large German Chilean priority research program that I coordinated with Friedhelm von Blankenburg, and it just finished actually. So what's fascinating about this area is that you have pretty much the same tectonic boundary on the west coast here, but you go from the arid Atacama region in the north. So this is the Pan de Azúcar study area I'll be looking at. And as you move south, you move into semi-arid Mediterranean and then temperate humid environments. And by the time you get down to the south here, you have temperate humid rainforests, much like you would see, for example, in the Olympic Peninsula in the western US in Washington state. So this area here, you have a large precipitation gradient. This results in a large gradient in vegetation cover and leaf area index that occurs in these areas. Okay. Just briefly, I know this community is probably quite familiar with this, but I'm going to be showing a lot of results from cosmogenic nuclides. And just to give you a little bit of background in this, the concept here is that you have these high energy cosmic rays coming into the atmosphere. These are protons in this case. Results in a cascade of reactions in the atmosphere, including the production of carbon-14. And then a byproduct of this is that you get what we call the in situ produced nuclides. This occurs with a variety of different isotopes, but I'll be focusing a lot on beryllium-10 today. And these are accumulated in the upper 2 meters here. Now, there's quite a bit we can do with this. Basically, this gives us a clock where we have more or less constant flux of cosmic rays producing these nuclides here. And it allows us to look at denudation rates and also ages of surfaces if you're interested in that. So the first set of observations I want to present to you relates to soil production rates and how these vary depending on the climate and ecological gradient you're looking at. So if we take kind of an idealized diagram here of a land or soil profile, I guess, you have a variety of different processes active here that are leading to its evolution: the physical erosion, chemical weathering occurring at depth, both laterally and otherwise. And we're constantly producing bedrock down here that is going into saprolite and then eventually becoming a mobile soil layer. And if you look at the cosmogenic nuclide profile that versus depth, so this would be over about 2 meters distance here. In an ideal world, you would have an exponential decay of these nuclides as they would attenuate with depth, or the cosmic rays would attenuate with depth. Soil mixing perturbs that a little bit. But the key thing is that samples that are collected at kind of the interface between the saprolite and the mobile layer here can be used to determine soil production rate. And there's been lots and lots of literature on this and really interesting work that's going on to that. So one of the things Miriam Schaller and I did over the last couple of years was to look at this in these different Chilean study areas. And this is results from a paper we recently published. So on the vertical axis here in both plots, you have the soil production rate. And we're focusing here, I should say, on specifically granitic lithologies. So we were trying to minimize lithologic effects on how you would interpret this. And on the horizontal axis on the left here, we have mean annual precipitation. And then on the right-hand side for those same hill slopes, we have the leaf area index, present day leaf area index. The key point here that is rather interesting, last point I should mention, the Chilean sites I've indicated here. So this would be Atacama to going to temperate rainforests over here at this location. Those are the little blue dots here. The different colors represent different hill slopes because that could be a function also in terms of the soil production rate you have. But the key point is depending on, or it doesn't matter what hill slopes you're looking at, these polynomial fits through the data all show kind of the same pattern here, that they reach some sort of maximum in a soil production rate. But then interestingly, as you move to higher precipitation or higher leaf area index, they decline. Now, a lot of other studies haven't recognized this because these plots are typically plotted in log-log space. And if you plot this in log-log space, then you compress this whole trend and you don't actually see it. The interpretation or reason for this kind of nonlinear behavior that you would see here is that in these types of landscapes here, where you have more or less proportional increase in soil production rate with precipitation or leaf area index, is that these are ecosystems. So these would be sparsely vegetated to kind of semi-arid Mediterranean climates. And you have the ecosystem is in a nutrient acquisition mode. So it's basically, you have a lot of active biogenic weathering that's leading to the breakdown of rock and increased soil production rates. However, eventually you start building really thick soils as you move into these wetter climates here. And the root base for these different plants, it's not deep enough in order to do this nutrient acquisition. So what you end up with in these types of settings here are ecosystems where you have a lot of nutrient recycling going on. And that has a noticeable effect then on the soil production rates in that you're going to decrease the soil production rate simply because you're shielding the fresh bedrock from the biogenic activity there. And in addition to various hydrologic factors that influence the weathering that's occurring there. So that's one line of evidence suggesting that we have a mechanism for nonlinear interactions between biota and surface processes. The next set of observations I want to show you, again, use cosmogenic nuclides, but in this case, it's a sample coming from river sediment, and you have a catchment here. And basically from that sample, then you can get the catchment average denudation rates that are occurring there. And We spent a number of years investigating this on the west coast of South America here, going from close to the equator all the way down south to the southernmost point here. This is still non-glaciated during the LGM, and looking at a lot of catchments along here. So we used existing data, recalculated what the production rates would be, so everything was handled consistently, and then went through the exercise of comparing those catchment average denudation rates as a function of the vegetation cover that was in those catchments, the climate data in terms of temperature, precipitation, and also different topographic metrics relevant to each catchment. So from this, what we get, I'll actually go forward to this one. These are the denudation rates that vary with latitude in these different catchments here. And this is pretty interesting. So these, in a second, you'll see how the vegetation and climate vary along these things. But what's interesting here is that it looks kind of noisy is the initial reaction. You have very low denudation rates in the more tropical areas close to the equator here. It increases and it steadily decreases as you approach the Atacama region here, stays low across the Atacama. And then as you start to go further south again, where it starts to get wetter, those denudation rates start to increase close to levels you saw further in the north. So there seems to be some sort of symmetry in the denudation rates around this hyper-arid zone that you have going on there. I mentioned comparisons to a variety of different other data sets. So this now is how the vegetation cover varies. This is, I forget exactly, I think it's around a 20-year compilation of MODIS data. And what you have is the mean value shown in a dot for any individual catchment. The dashed lines represent the 2 sigma variation in vegetation cover within that catchment. And then the solid line here is a 5-point moving average through that data there. And what you see is how the different ecosystems kind of mimic what's happening with latitude. So you go from heavy vegetation in the north, progressively starts decreasing when you hit the sparsely vegetated Atacama region, and then starts increasing again towards the south here. And this vegetation trend, of course, not surprisingly, mimics what you see in the mean annual precipitation going across here, and also this precipitation trend looks similar in the paleoclimate for the region as well, which I don't have time to get into. But you go from high precipitation in the north and warmer temperatures, which contributes to this larger vegetation cover, then decreasing precipitation to the Atacama and then increasing again towards the south. When you look at the average slope angles, so this, again, same kind of convention on both these plots. The dot is the average slope for a catchment. The dashed lines are the 2 sigma variation, and then a moving average fit through that. The slopes don't show as much variation with latitude, so consistently around 20 degrees with some more local anomalies going on in different places here. So what we did with this, if you're interested in catchment erosion, it's a non-unique problem in the sense that, all these different factors that I've indicated here can factor into what the denudation rates would be in any given catchment. And so we did kind of a 2-step process in this. And the first was to do a multivariate statistical analysis to understand which variable is actually explaining most of the variance in the denudation rate data. And I'll spare you showing the details of that analysis. But the key point is that 63% of the variance can be explained by basically a combination of vegetation cover, precipitation, and slope. But by far, the biggest contributor to explaining the variance is actually the vegetation cover, then followed by the precipitation rates within the catchments here. So what that indicates is that a lot of the signal, whatever that signal is, within the catchment denudation rates can be explained by vegetation cover here. The second step of analysis that we did was then to pick out those important factors that explain a lot of the variance and look at how conduct a Pearson's correlation coefficient. That's what's shown on the right-hand side here, and I don't have time to go into what's shown with the slope and erosion rates here, but on the right-hand side, what you see in green is the Pearson's correlation coefficient between catchment average erosion rates and the vegetation. And the uncertainties are kind of width in any bar you see here. This is because we had to bin things over 2 degrees of latitude in order to get good, reliable statistics on this. And then a Monte Carlo analysis gave us the width of each of these boxes so that we can capture the 95% confidence interval on these correlations. And what I want to emphasize here is that the relationship between erosion rates and vegetation that you see in green here varies systematically with latitude. So we have 0 correlation shown down the middle here. And if you're in the Atacama region here, you have an inverse correlation, meaning that if you have higher vegetation, you have lower erosion rates, or inversely to that. But this systematically changes as you move out of this zone. Now, what's interesting about this is that you progressively get a stronger positive correlation with vegetation as you move north, and then you reach some sort of level of vegetation around 60% cover within catchments, and then it starts to reverse and go the other direction here. And this is actually the trend you would expect from intuition, and that the more vegetation you have, the less catchment erosion you might have. But clearly there's a variety of different processes going on in here that would give you an inflection point such as this. So those are the observations that kind of illustrate that we have some nonlinear behavior occurring here between vegetation and erosion rates. What I want to do now is illustrate a little bit the modeling framework that we've been developing over the last decade to try and understand these interactions. So that takes us then into the second part of this talk, okay? So where we're headed then is to actually develop a process-based model that accounts for all these different factors here. And I add paleoclimate in here instead of climate, and that is because the legacy or history of precipitation is potentially important when we're comparing to things like cosmogenic isotopes, because these things are integrating over millennial timescales. And so in parallel to considering paleoclimate here, we also need to consider then the vegetation history and what that is within a catchment, particularly if we're going to be comparing millennial timescale denudation rates to present day denudation, which is what I just showed you. So we're going to go through these different components. I'm going to explain first the paleoclimate modeling approach here. We've done this in a 2-pronged approach here. So the first thing is there's this wonderful data set called Trace21K. This is an NCAR-based model. And what's nice about this is that it's a continuous general circulation model simulation that was run from the last glacial maximum to present. The downside is to do that, you have to run it at really coarse resolution. So if you're not familiar with how general circulation models work, the basic idea is you're taking the atmosphere and land surface here, you're discretizing it, and you're solving equations for conservation of mass, momentum, and energy. You have different boundary conditions, such as how the sea surface temperature is changing, how the land surface is changing here, and you have an equation of state that gives you a prediction for how the climate's changing. These same types of models are used for weather forecasting as well, and there's a long history of how these have been developed in the literature. So that was the first approach that we've done. The second is to evaluate how good these core simulations were. We also conducted a series of higher resolution global atmospheric circulation models conducted at about 80 by 80 kilometer resolution. And we did those for the time slices that you see here. And because these are higher resolution, we can only run them long enough to get the mean climatology for the orbital parameters and vegetation cover at these time periods here. The end result of this exercise is that actually you capture, there's no noticeable differences, particularly for South America with the lower resolution models here. So we went with those to get a continuous time series of precipitation. So with these paleoclimate models, this is just an example on the right-hand side showing you the difference in mean monthly precipitation if you take the LGM precipitation and subtract from it pre-industrial conditions there. And these flashing blue and red colors that you see here, these basically equate to changes on the order of 100 to 500% in what the mean monthly precipitation is around the world at these different time periods here. So we expect that and the limited proxy observations also support this, that there were substantial paleoclimate changes in South America over this time period. Interestingly, though, although the magnitude of precipitation and temperature has changed with latitude, the actual pattern of precipitation hasn't changed. So it's kind of an offset of the present day precipitation with latitude curve that I showed you before. So that's the paleoclimate. Now, once you have the paleoclimate predictions, you can then start thinking about how the vegetation would change. And just like with paleoclimate data, with vegetation, paleovegetation, you can try and use proxy data for this, like pollen analyses, for example. But the problem is you're always dealing with kind of point measurements of that, and also specific time zones, not necessarily a nice integrated picture. So we approach this again from a modeling perspective and use the paleoclimate predictions to give us vegetation predictions. And the approach we're using here is dynamic vegetation models. And there are several of these. There are, well, actually two that are really good. And these are kind of routinely used now in climate, larger future predictions of climate change as well. In this case, I'm showing you the LPJ guess model. And the idea here is that this model accounts for plant physiological controls on plant growth. And so all these different factors that you see listed here are taken into account. So on the right-hand side, the way things are parameterized in a model like this, let's start with the top here, is that you define different plant functional types. And if you're not familiar with what a plant functional type is, you can think of it as trees, shrubs, grasses, okay? Now, within each category here, you can have lots of different types of trees or lots of different types of shrubs. In these types of models, then you have some sort of environmental space where these different species might thrive here. And then you come down to, once you start combining these things, that you end up with a realized niche of where these things and how they could live together within a particular ecosystem. And the other big advantage of this particular model here is that it also accounts for competition between these different plant functional spaces. So whatever ecosystem you predict here, there are parameterizations based on observations for how these different plant types will compete for space, water, nutrients, and light as that's changing here. So the end result then is, as your climate changes, this ecosystem can evolve essentially. The steps then for kind of coupling this are that you start with a time series here of different paleoclimate predictions here that are relatively coarse within the Trace 21K data. We developed a statistical downscaling approach to get this at higher resolution, where we can put it on an individual landscape then. And the different color coding that you see here just represents things that are basically river valleys versus hill slopes versus ridge crests. And those can have different soil thicknesses, different local climates as well. That result then goes into the dynamic vegetation model. And then for any given time slice of a climate, you're predicting what the ecosystem would look like. And then that's carried forward into the next time step as well. So that's the modeling procedure. And we've conducted that. I haven't covered landscapes yet. I'll get to that in a second. So we've done that for each of these 4 Earth-shaped study areas. And you see photographs of them here on the right-hand side, just to give you a sense of how these vary as you go from the Atacama region to semi-arid Mediterranean and then temperate rainforests with these beautiful Araucaria trees that are sitting there. Okay, so how well do models like that do? Well, we went through climate data. You always end up, or paleoclimate models, I should say, you end up always comparing to present day reanalysis data sets. And I won't show you that because they do fairly well for this part of South America. For vegetation, what we did is to compare, in this case, we ran the LPJ GUESS vegetation model for all of Chile. And what's shown here is the present day predicted vegetation cover, where you go then essentially from the Atacama region here down to the rainforests in Patagonia in that region here. And it does well on that, basically reproduces the present day vegetation cover as we see today. So our 4 different areas of investigation in non-glaciated areas are sitting here. And what I want to do is show you an example of, if we start in the Atacama arid region, how this looks with time. So what we have on the x-axis here is time before present from LGM to present day. The lower plot is the vegetation cover, so very low vegetation cover. And notice that despite the fact that you're going from a glacial period to interglacial, the total amount of vegetation doesn't change so much here. On the top, what's shown here is, again, time versus plant functional type represented with respect to leaf area index. So that's what the numbers represent here. And the different colors here represent different plant functional types. There's not a lot of them shown because it's a coastal Atacama region. But the point is that it's pretty boring. As you go from the LGM to present, you haven't had a lot of change in vegetation cover, nor have you had a lot of change in what types of plants are sitting there. As you move south, there's a gradual trend, and I'll just jump to the southernmost one to show you kind of the end member here. Please ignore the thick black line, that's a different parameter. So what's shown in the light gray here is, again, the vegetation cover. Okay, you see variations on the order of 5 to 15% in the vegetation cover, but no huge change in that as you move towards present. What is changing a lot are the plant functional types that you have. And so the different colors here now represent a broader range of plant functional types, and I'll just draw your attention here to the dark green, which stands for TEBE. This is temperate broadleaf evergreen trees. So as you move towards present here, you start losing more of the shrubs and grasses, and you start getting a higher percentage of broadleaf evergreen trees. Now, why is this important? Well, okay, first of all, it's interesting that your vegetation cover doesn't change much, but what is changing a lot is what types of vegetation are there. And what that means then is that if we want to understand how landscapes will evolve as a function of biota, we need to be able to account for having different types of plant functional types and how these evolve with time here, if we're comparing to kind of long-term millennial timescale denudation rates. So this then brings me to the timescales of vegetation effects on topography. And I want to go through a couple different examples here, if I have time. I'm going to start with millennial timescales, and if we have time, I'll come to seasonal timescales. This also now comes to a point where I'm going to bring in the landscape evolution modeling and how these previous climate and paleoclimate and vegetation models link to a landscape evolution model. So landscape evolution models, what you see growing here on the right-hand side is an example of a landscape evolution model run over 40 million years, going from flat topography to building something that's reaching an equilibrium here. And our end goal was to be able to predict topography as a function of time, tectonics, so rock uplift, the climate, paleoclimate, vegetation, and surface processes that are active there. And we've done a lot of different studies. My background's actually originally in tectonics, and spent a lot of time in a previous project looking at how tectonics is varied in these different study areas. And basically, we have a very low rate of rock uplift that's going on in this area here. These constraints mainly come from thermochronology type studies here. Then, so we're prescribing this essentially based on observations, and it's not so variable between the different study areas that I showed you. Then from the climate perspective, what we're doing is we'll be imposing a transient climate history over the last 21,000 years. And we'll have a transient vegetation history that's climate dependent from that dynamic vegetation model. The other big part thing we need to consider is soil production rate. So in other words, how fast are we producing loose material that can be moving down in the hill slopes and the rivers? In this case, we don't have good, at least relationships that I trust yet, for how soil production rates vary with vegetation. So instead, what we did was work with observations based on measurements that we had made in a project. And then the key is, okay, now we want to be able to predict fluvial and hill slope processes as a function of these changing vegetation conditions through time here. So just briefly, the different components of this in a little more detail. I won't go too heavy into the equations, but they're in the references that you see or will see. So I already showed you soil production rates and how they vary. And basically, it's these blue symbols tucked in here is what was measured from a series of head-on profiles that were taken in multiple locations within each of the study areas here. And they do actually vary across these study areas here, okay? So that was one input. Then the landscape evolution component of this, we're working now with the LandLab space model. Many of you have probably heard of LandLab. The space component handles sediment deposition and entrainment. And the basic idea here is, for those of you not familiar with how these work, is that when you have a landscape like this, it's discretized into a variety of different cells here. And within any given cell here, we're looking at the conservation of mass. So we have rock uplift occurring here. We can have sediment deposition that occurs. We can have sediment entrainment that occurs, or we can have entrainment of rock that occurs here. And all of this is a function then of we're accounting for the flow of water over this landscape, or in the case of hill slope processes, nonlinear diffusion of the sediment downslope here. So where does vegetation come in here? The idea is that when you have a mass balance type equation for this, so in any particular grid cell here, we're looking at the change in elevation with time, okay, as a function of vegetation. And the way we do that is you need the mass input from rock uplift. So this is what we've prescribed based on our other studies. And then we have a lowering of the landscape by these two different components here, be it hill slope or fluvial. And what we've done is these terms then are parameterized as a function of changing vegetation cover within that pixel here. And the approach we followed, this is close to what was done in Istanbul and Bras. We've published it in Schmid et al. And the idea here then is as you're changing the percent vegetation cover for hill slope processes, you're changing the rate at which hill slope diffusion moves that sediment down slope. In the case of fluvial processes here, what's nicely comes from engineering literature is that we have Manning's roughness coefficients for how the shear stress of water moving across the surface changes as a function of different plant functional types. So that's implemented into the model here, okay? Okay, so the model coupling. Now, this a big issue when you start doing landscape evolution modeling like this is what your initial condition is and what transients you might be introducing into the landscape based on that initial condition. In my experience with using these models over decades is that you can never reproduce reality with them easily. And instead, our approach has always been to consider synthetic landscapes to focus on. So in other words, they're kind of tuned to the conditions of a particular area. But the idea is we want to understand how the different parameters that we're controlling within the model are affecting the general behavior of that landscape. So I'm not going to show you a reconstruction of the Chilean Coastal Cordillera, but I am going to show you how different processes would influence erosion rates over landscapes there. So I'm going to focus what I present here looking at catchment average erosion rates over large areas within a domain like this. So to get at some of the complications or caveats to things I just mentioned to you, what we do with these models is we set them up. We have what we call a spin-up phase. And as I mentioned before, the coastal cordillera has been coming up for around 40 million years. So we're running the models to equilibrium, which it actually takes about this long to get an equilibrium landscape with these very slow rock uplift rates that I showed you here. And we're reaching this equilibrium by keeping the LGM climate and vegetation conditions fixed. So in other words, nothing's changing over this 40 million years, except the topography. The forcings are staying constant. Okay, once we enter the last 20,000 years, then we're hitting a transient phase that we're looking at in more detail. And this is where the model coupling comes in. So we're predicting the vegetation change that occurs as a function of the climate that I showed you. That is then output into the land lab space model here, which calculates how the topography changes. And then as that topography changes, we're feeding that back into the vegetation model to see if the vegetation needs to adapt to that. Okay, so that's kind of the process. This is looping around on about 100-year time scale, which is about the turnover time for ecosystems when they occur. Okay, that's the procedure. So what do you get out of this? Well, let's start with looking at, again, time here versus vegetation cover. And the different colors here represent the vegetation cover, and in this case, you're seeing mean annual temperature and how this changes from LGM to present. As hinted at before, if you're in the Atacama region here, not a lot's going on, and that's not a surprise. We've known the Atacama's been pretty much dry and desolate for about 21 million years at least. As you move further south to the temperate rainforest area, what you see is that the different plant functional types are changing. So this is the increase in temperate broadleaf evergreen trees that I illustrated before. That's happening at the expense of grass. The amount of grass is going down, and the amount of shrubs you have is close to zero there. So what does that do to the catchment average erosion rates? Well, that's what you see on the right-hand side here. So now the vertical axis is erosion rate in these, and then the blue line tucked in here is the mean annual precipitation coming from the paleoclimate reconstructions. And what you see in the Atacama region is that, first of all, this dashed line here in both of these is the prescribed rock uprate. In the Atacama region, you have some high frequency variations that are occurring here, sometimes slightly higher erosion rates, sometimes less. These equate to roughly 25% or so, 5 to 25% changes in erosion rates that are occurring here. But it's basically oscillating around the rock uplift or the mean rate of denudation. So in other words, this is a setting where, tectonics is basically controlling the long-term average rate, and climate and vegetation change are giving you this high frequency variation here. Situation is a little bit different when you move to temperate evergreen settings here. First of all, notice you don't have as much high frequency variation like you did before. There's some tucked in there, but that's not the dominant signal. And what you see is a longer wavelength signal that's occurring here that has very different behavior from what you see in the above and in the previous plot. So the natural question is then, if you're looking at these records here and comparing visually to whatever's going on with the precipitation or what's going on with the vegetation change here, which factor is driving these changes here? How much of it is due to the precipitation changes? How much of it is due to the vegetation changes? To answer that question or questions, what we did is a correlation analysis on these time series here. And I'll start with the arid north setting here. So what the numbers represent is the Pearson's correlation coefficient. And you don't really need to worry about all this. It's just every parameter correlated with everyone. You just need to focus on this column here. And the key point is that mean annual precipitation shown here is that you have a moderate positive correlation between that and the erosion rates, okay? And then when you start looking at changes in plant functional types, grasses, shrubs, trees, or the total vegetation cover, that it's very weak to non-existent, the correlation. So what this means then is that, in a setting here, that this is where precipitation and essentially stochastic precipitation events are dominating the erosion. And that's not such a huge surprise. Your intuition would probably tell you that as well. Things are a little different when you look at the temperate south here, where you have a lot more vegetation present. And the things I want to draw your attention to is that you still have a positive correlation with mean annual precipitation here. But now, if you look at the total vegetation cover, you have a strong negative correlation. In other words, the more vegetation you have, the less erosion you have in these settings here, okay? And there's a transition that's going on between these different patterns here. The key is that the different ecosystems are having a different magnitude and of effect on the erosion rates. And this I don't have time to show you the in-between cases here, but every ecosystem is behaving differently in terms of how these correlations respond. So there really is no simple answer to say, okay, no, it's just one parameter that can explain. So in other words, just vegetation cover cannot explain alone the changes in catchment erosion rates that we see. In the last few minutes, I just want to jump to the last shorter time scale here. This is work that's currently in press in Earth surface dynamics. And our approach was a little bit different. It's still the same model I showed you before and the same governing equations. The only difference here is that we've pulled off the dynamic vegetation model. And instead, what we're doing is we took a time series. This runs from, it's a 5-year time series here. Actually, 5 years is right here, of precipitation that's observed in 4 different study areas and the vegetation change that occurs there. What we've done then is just to keep repeating this time series, done this over thousands of years. The key point in doing this was to see what the seasonal effects are and how seasonal changes in vegetation influence different erosion rates in different ecosystems. I'll spend less time on this than the previous point, but I want to show you, just kind of reinforce the point of how different the response can be depending on where you're looking at. So on the top panel here, what you're looking at, horizontal axis is seasons going from 2015 to 2019, okay? So just plotting the seasonal means here. And this is how the precipitation varies. And each line here represents these different study areas. And this is how the vegetation cover is changing on seasonal or annual basis across these regions here. The lower plot then shows you how the catchment average erosion rates are changing through time. And what you see are variations. Sorry, the units are a little bit counterintuitive. It's meters per season. But you see variations in the catchment erosion rates that are occurring from season to season here. And when you get unusual events, like this is an El Nino year, that you can get very different effects that are occurring in some settings, particularly because these are such water-deprived areas here. When you start adding a little bit more water, you get a lot more vegetation that's going on there. Again, to kind of tease apart how much of these wiggles and signals here is due to climate versus vegetation. This diagram kind of summarizes that, where you're looking at the 4 different study areas going here, and then this is the amplitude of change in the erosion rates. And what we did were 3 different simulations. The green one is the fully coupled, so this would be, you could think of it as reality. The other 2 simulations, we hold either precipitation or vegetation constant, and then allow the other parameter to vary. And when I say held them constant, we held them at the mean value. So in other words, this was a way of seeing what the sensitivity is of the landscape to variations in just one parameter. I want to draw your attention here to if we hold precipitation constant, but allow vegetation to vary, this is the trend you see here. And so you have a maximum of about 30% of the change in erosion rates that occurs is due to vegetation on a seasonal basis. And that varies between about 5% and 30%. The other thing that's interesting about this, you see that as you change latitude here, the effect starts to get higher. In other words, vegetation effects are more prominent in the semi-arid and Mediterranean type climates. But if you're in arid or heavily vegetated areas, you're just not getting a lot of seasonal variation in vegetation to drive these change. And so again, what you're kind of getting here is a nonlinear or bidirectional change in erosion rates that's very ecosystem dependent there. Okay, just going to quickly wrap things up here. So you might be wondering what are these different sources of these nonlinear relationships between vegetation and erosion? I've hinted at them already a little bit. The first one comes from this nonlinear relationship between soil production rates and vegetation. I think this is probably the process we understand the least well. If we take that kind of relationship here that I showed you, and we also think about how the physical erosion rates are correlating or not correlating with vegetation, you can actually take this plot and rotate it 90 degrees. And this kind of gradient and leaf area index is what you would start seeing across this latitudinal range here. And so clearly, you know, the rates at which you're having soil production and vegetation interacting with that could somehow be feeding into what we see in terms of the physical erosion rates here. This is not well understood, in my opinion. This is going to take a while to understand from a process perspective much better. The other thing I'll do, though, is highlight, I didn't show these equations earlier, but in the landscape evolution model, when we're looking at diffusivity variations or variations in erodibility that come as a function of vegetation, for diffusivity, the hill slope diffusivity is varying with vegetation cover within a negative exponential function here. And that's shown with the black curve shown here. Whereas for fluvial processes with these Manning roughness coefficients that you see here, these are power law relationships, which are the green and the blue. The key point here is that as you change vegetation cover, if you're looking at the hill slope diffusivity or the erodibility here, this relationship, you know, a little bit of change in vegetation in this realm has potential to change erosion rates a lot more than if you're out in this realm here. And that's basically what was manifesting this different behavior that you saw in the models there. The last source of the nonlinearity I want to bring up relates to just a more biologic effect. And this is now Chilean data shown with the black dots here, or sorry, the black curve. So as you increase vegetation cover and look at mean annual precipitation, this is not a linear relationship, okay? It looks almost exponential. Again, the key point is that if you think of one of landscapes experiencing a plus minus 10% change here, you need a very different amount of change in precipitation rate if you're in a wet setting to invoke a 10% change in vegetation around that dot compared to if you're in a more arid setting here. So this nonlinear relationship between precipitation and vegetation is also factoring into these models. So just very briefly then, to kind of conclude things here, do we have this bidirectional or nonlinear relationship? Yes, absolutely. Varies depending on arid or temperate regions that you're looking at. The magnitude of effect on transient erosions from last glacial maximum to present is on the order of 10 to 25%. And finally, in terms of seasonal effects of vegetation, precipitation is actually the most important factor over seasonal timescales, but 5 to 30% of the vegetation or erosion rate changes that are predicted are actually due to the seasonal vegetation changes. So that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot for this very complete talk. So the chat is open for questions. Feel free to ask them, and we'll repeat them and we'll read them. Or you can also raise your hand if you want to ask your question directly to Todd. Right, so I'll start with the first question from Liam Reinhardt. What drives vegetation life and death in the vegetation model? I'm thinking back to Erkan's earlier model that included fire, for example.
Yeah, that's a big difference between, what Erkan did was they prescribed fire events as a disturbance, and they picked a constant kind of recurrence interval for that. So the vegetation death is determined by, first of all, the climate conditions. So, and what's taken into account there is the temperature and precipitation history. Also, what's really important there, what the seasonal highs are. So, for example, if you had high temperature amount or warm temperatures over one particular season, that can contribute to death, as well as drought, of course. And then fires are also built into this, but the what we did in our case, disturbances from fires are included in the LPJ gas model. We parameterize the stochasticity of that based on observations that are pre-human, because it changes a lot more recently. Then the birth is really a function of what plant functional types you allow to exist in that setting. So what we chose there for that is based on the plant functional types that are there and also in the pollen records. So depending on the climate conditions that you have, then it goes back to this plot of like where a different niche is realized and where it's optimally occurring. So that's basically controlling it. The plant physiology is essentially controlling the birth. Yeah. So if you look at these models in detail, what you'll see actually is if you have a fire event, you clear out the vegetation and then you get a natural succession where the grasses are coming in first and then the shrubs and then the trees, if trees can grow there. Yeah.
All right, we'll move on to the next question from Caroline. Oh, sorry, I missed it. So we have one from Pedro Val. Is there, and if so, how did you account for severe collinearity of vegetation and precipitation variables in the multivariate regression models?
Severe, okay, collinearity. So the regression, the multivariate regression was assumed linear relationship between things. It was not a nonlinear multivariate regression, if that's what you're wondering. So, but how did you account for severe co-nonlinear? Well, I mean, if there's that would be picked up. So what we did was a factor analysis. So if you have 10 parameters and covariation going on with 5 of them, then you pick that up in a factor analysis by getting different factor loadings, essentially. A factor analysis is very similar to a PCA analysis in terms of what it produces there. So maybe I've missed the question, but that's how it was done.
Okay, thank you so much, Todd. It was really fascinating talk. I think we skipped the question from Caroline. She was asking, do you consider precipitation intensity and possible changes in intensity over the period? And related to these, do you use a threshold in the fluvial erosion component of the model? Thank you.
Yes, so the last one, threshold, is included in there, and it's also for the sediment entrainment deposition part. That's accounted for. The first part of the question was I missed it.
If you consider the precipitation intensity and possible changes.
Okay. Yep. So in the millennial timescale stuff, we were dealing with mean annual precipitation rates from the, well, less than that for the vegetation modeling, but for the erosion component, it was mean annual. So you miss the extremes in that. However, for the seasonal stuff, that's in there. And that's a whole nother paper we're about to submit based using the same kind of data sets as I showed for the seasonal variations, but looking at the extreme events, because as I hinted at, there are El Nino effects in this area, and they vary with latitude. So you have more pronounced El Nino effects on extreme precipitation in the north than in the south. So we're looking at that in a separate study. And that is embedded in the seasonal stuff I showed you there, but I didn't plot things in a way where you could really see it. But it's a great question. Yeah.
Right. Next question is from Kai. Thanks for a fascinating talk. The negative correlation between vegetation and erosion in the model depends on how the relationship is parameterized. Does it come from empirical data or models? I assume it's not from the Chile data, where a positive relation between vegetation and erosion can be observed.
Yeah, so okay, so the parameterization used in the model, so as I said, this is based upon the work of Istanbuloglu and Bras. That approach is based on a series of observations or references I had in the slide, but one of them is Prosser, I believe. These were hill slope based experiments that were done in California. There's also some flume experiments that have been done. with different vegetation covers to get the relationships that are shown there. And then the whole Manning's roughness integration of what we did, this comes from from engineering literature, where they have measured these things. So, but to be honest, I would say these equations are more hypotheses than laws at this point. So we're using what's out there right now in the literature, but I was surprised. What we really do need a lot more field-based measurements of how these things vary with different ecosystems, and they're just time-consuming and difficult to make. So, yeah.
All right, we'll move on to the next question. There are quite a lot of them. So this one is from Mike Kirkby. Have you thought about the importance of valley north-south asymmetry, which varies a lot across your transect?
Yes, it does. A great question, Mike. So yeah, there's some really nice papers by Erkan Istanbuloglu, and then also Omar, I forget his last name, on this, looking at, so the main issue is that if you have different aspects, north facing or south facing, you have different, your water cycle is different, and the water availability. So that would, we did account for that in the dynamic vegetation models, because we do know the orientation, and then so the solar radiation is coming in, and we did it very crudely in terms of if it's north or south, not really taking into account the exact angle and stuff. Those effects you wouldn't see in what I was presenting. But yes, that's a very active process, and I think that could be a whole nother level of insightful. Well, Erkan's been doing this in his group. He's still doing it, looking at these effects. And you do have marked differences in the vegetation types within one catchment, whether it's north or south facing. So that's important. Yeah.
Okay, the next one, that probably will be the last one. Are there any considerations of things such as changes in intensity of precipitation and patterns of landslides, mudslides effects on the vegetation and erosion patterns?
It's similar to the previous question. So in what I showed you, you wouldn't see those effects, but in the seasonal kind of results I showed you, yeah, so there was high intensity precipitation events that were going into that. And in that case, we weren't using a dynamic vegetation model, or rather just observations. However, in the modeling framework I presented to you, the dynamic vegetation models like to operate on an annual basis, and you can get, if you have really wet years, for example, then and consistently have those, you will change the ecosystem that's there in these. So there's over 350 publications applying these dynamic vegetation models. It's a whole nother community that's doing this and looking at these things on a variety of different timescales. But yeah, that could be looked at in more detail.
There are still a couple of questions, but we're reaching toward the end. So the next one is from Dongfeng Li. Thank you, Todd, for the awesome talk. Have you looked at the role of glaciers in driving the catchment average erosion in the Andes and the interaction of glacier advance recession with climate and vegetation change in controlling erosion?
Yeah, good question. So in the catchments that you see in front of you here, these haven't been glaciated as far as we know. So having said that, when I presented the cosmogenic nuclide data along all of South America, the maximum glaciation in one of the catchments was 10%. So they were pretty limited. As you go south from here, so the LGM ice made it to about 40 degrees south in South America. And there you start to get, you had situations where they're continuous glacial cover. So I haven't looked at that yet, but actually one of the projects I'm trying to get going now is called Ice Shape instead of Earth Shape, and it's looking at these effects in deglaciated catchments as well, and how vegetation succession in these catchments with latitude and elevation influences the the erosion and soil formation. Yep, good question.
All right, so still a couple questions to go. This one is from John Jensen. Bit more of a comment than a question. He says that the erosion rate outputs from the LEM are fair enough, but how can we test this with Cosmo when a fast erosion rate, say 200 meter per million years, integrates the last 3,000 years, whereas slow rate, 1 meter per million year, integrates the last 600,000 years. Systematic variation in your rates in relation to vegetation.
Yep, good question. We get into that in the supplement of the Starka et al. Paper. So we show what the integration times, or have a table at least, with what these integration timescales are. And they range between, I forget the low end, it's a couple thousand years, up to 120,000 years, but most of them are actually integrating over a similar time scale, which would be around 25,000 years or so. And when we calculated that, that's actually what motivated me to say, okay, now we need to look closer at the paleoclimate. So in that same supplement of that paper, we actually present paleoclimate simulation results for the LGM to the present and how that varies with these catchments here. And I hinted at this in the talk. The main thing is, it's hard to do with your hands, but if you're looking with latitude here, the pattern of, so wet, I gotta do it. Okay, wet in the north to dry and then wet again. That's what we see today in terms of precipitation. And if you go back to the LGM, you get the same shape pattern here, but everything's shifted over towards drier conditions. And that's kind of normal. Glacial time, you have cooler air, drier, or less precipitation. So the effects, that there would be a difference in the precipitation available for erosion, but the pattern stays the same. And so everything would kind of be shifting the same direction. So that's the best we can do. Yeah.
Okay, so now we have the last question. Sorry, Todd, that
No
people
problem.
are very interested in your work.
I've got nothing else to do.
Yes, you do. You already show us such amazing results. I think this is also a bit more than a comment. It's from Arno. He says that great talk, and especially for finding an optimum between increased model realism and excessive focus on topography reproduction. He's wondered about your regolith in the model. It has no properties other than its thickness, mass, if he gets right. In reality, there are substantial soil differences across your north-south transit, for instance, in terms of average soil texture, that drive infiltration, vegetation, and hill slope process differences. Should we focus on soils instead of vegetation in our overall conceptual model? What do you think?
Yes, I think you should. And we did that also, actually. I didn't get into that. In the parameterization for diffusivity, there's a baseline diffusivity and then how that varies to vegetation and the exponent there. And that baseline diffusivity, we varied, and we spent a lot of time trying to figure out that number, because you get very different topographic reliefs, for example, when you start changing that. So we tuned that parameter to each study area. And you're completely right. I've dug soil pits in all these areas, and that's the data from Miriam Schaller actually came from these soil pits. So if you're in the arid north, I mean, I guess I don't even know if you call it a soil, because I'm not sure it's mobile, but it's basically just gypsum and salt, precipitates on this crust. You need a jackhammer to get into it. Whereas in the south, you have these very different organic rich, you have very clear A, B, C horizons in them. So we accounted for those effects as best you can, but to be honest, it doesn't matter too much exactly what it is when you're looking at long time scale evolution. I mean, it's important to get it close so that what we aim to target were things like, is the topographic relief similar to what we see today, are the average hill slope angles similar to what we see today. And then if that's the case, then we kept that parameter, but we mapped out that whole space. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Right. Thanks a lot again, Todd, for the talk and for the captivating discussion. That's the end of today's Landscapes Live. So yeah, I think we can clap again for for this great talk, and it will be uploaded on YouTube. And we're looking forward to seeing you for next week's talk from Alice Pepin about organic matter and soils. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you.